Hi, everybody, and welcome to the panel on elections versus thrones. And I believe there was a much longer name for it than that, but I don't have it written down, so I apologize. But we're definitely talking about government world building. And the first question we're going to open up with is, why do you think so many science fiction and fantasy stories are built around monarchies and empires? And whoever wants to start, go ahead.
Well, may I go?
Oh, yeah, go on. Go ahead.
No,
Whitney,
Whitney, please. Whitney, you were first.
I kind of want to pull back and look at, I guess, where a lot of books are being published from. And if we do look at that, then it, is the United States at this point where a lot of books are coming out of. And for many North Americans, United Statesians, monarchy is kind of novel in a sense that it's not something that, it's a day-to-day thing. Whereas, like when I was living in England, it's just part of day-to-day life. So I think part of it is just that framing of who's writing books.
Right, definitely.
I noticed a trend too. I think there's three things playing into it. One, writing a monarchy is simpler. So I think there's sometimes a lack of imagination. In science fiction, sometimes people are just writing fantasy wearing a science fiction hat. So you end up with that as well. And third, I think sometimes there's a lack of awareness of the way different government systems have and can be evolved. We tend to lump them together, but people would have called some of the high period of Han China a monarchy, despite the fact it was a monarchy sitting on top of a gigantic bureaucracy. You probably could have just, in some centuries, you could have just put a scarecrow on the throne and nothing would have changed. And there's not an understanding of the different complexities of history. It gets filtered through simplified understanding. Out of four, there's probably some wish fulfillment too of it'd just be easier if we had a king.
I agree with those sentiments, and I think part of it too is, as our first speaker mentioned, United States, it is a product of multiple empires, and many of us, can trace our roots to, one empire or another. I'm of Caribbean background, so that's kind of part of everyone's experience in the New World. So I think it does have this point of fascination for a lot of us, just because it's a lot of our heritage. And plus, you can kind of see throughout the history the faults of monarchy. So much power concentrated with one family or with one person. And it is like ripe for story building.
Yeah.
So definitely. I would actually add that my profession is actually IT management. So a great deal of my job is watching things go wrong because someone said something. And stability is not always interesting, but if your galactic empire is ruled by an inbred dude with 3 teeth who can only play poker, then you have a story.
Very true. Yeah, I like this. When I think of the story that I published recently with Shadowspark Publishing, like my novel, it's like a multicultural empire that's on like multiple moons and so many different cultures that don't get along, and they're all thrown together just through a kind of an accident of history. And it just, I think it just makes it so much more for like, shades of culture and class can really play out in an environment like that.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Sorry, go ahead, Whitney.
Speaking of culture and class, though, I think that goes back to what Stephen said about maybe being a little bit ignorant or potentially lazy. It's not just culture and class that are issues in monarchies. There are also issues. We have a constitutional republic here in the United States. Very huge issues. There's going to be those issues throughout, but I think it's a case of when authors may or may not be, examining the situations in their own backgrounds or day-to-day life.
If I could add to what Whitney said, I think that one thing that is rarely examined in any government story is the real issues of class and power. Takes on monarchy are simplistic in many cases. A quick look at even European history reveal how many people lived under a monarchy and then would murder the hell out of anyone in the monarchy they could in horrific ways. and we just assume they sit there and take it, or that class divisions vanished because everyone listened to the king. It is not true. And class is a huge part of anything with government.
Yeah, I think that brings us into our second question, actually, so that you guys can further those points. What are the pros and cons of telling stories with these types of governments? Anyone, take a stand. Go ahead.
If I could, my current novel series is a techno fantasy. It's what happens when a fantasy universe evolves into the space age. And it's a parliamentary democracy spread among city-states, which desperately want to argue they're not acting like nations while they act like nations. And in this case, it's a society that fears the past. They're afraid of monarchies. They're afraid of concentrated power. But that means that, the fun of that is you have people who are very political, a little bit mistrustful all the time, a little mistrustful of power concentrations. And that actually plays into the story because everyone's always doing a little bit of politics all the time. So they're freer, but everyone's got to be a little bit more aware, and there's always something behind the scenes. And I find that interesting to write people in a setting that is non-monarchical, but there are classes from ethnicity, origin, profession. And that's actually fun to write when you get out from under the simple monarchical class structures.
Out of perspective, sorry, Dustin, one thing. If we could try and focus on what maybe the impact for readers would be in reading this as well. Go ahead, Dustin.
I think that's a really interesting question in terms of pros and cons. And in my series, The Exiles of a Gilded Moon, I look at actually both the protagonist is from a realm which is kind of like ruled by like an absolute emperor, and there's conflicts with other. I don't want to divulge too much, but there's definitely different forms of government that are discussed outside of the idea of an empire, such as like a republic. I think the pros of describing like an empire is when he mentions it's simpler. People understand the idea of what that is, so you don't have to get into the nitty gritty without describing every aspect of it. I think the cons are you can fall into tropes usually like the Mad King. I think with republics, people think it's always egalitarian when you discuss it in sci-fi fantasy, but as we know, it's not always egalitarian, as we kind of brought up with class. So there's extensive pros and cons for both, and I think it just you have to find what really fits your story and what you're trying to convey.
Yeah, and I think if we want to add, what's useful for the reader or what's beneficial for the reader, pros there are, as an author, you have an opportunity to educate. You have an opportunity not only to tell a story, but also to show a viewpoint. So I guess that's where it's really critical for you as the author to be aware of where you're coming from, so that you're presenting, if you've got a point to make about a capitalist oligarchy, then you need to understand what you're saying in order to really get that across to the reader in such a way that obviously as soon as it's out there, the interpretation will be up to the reader. But so the pro there again is just taking your knowledge and your experience and your message and translating that to something that is a bit more digestible than perhaps a textbook is for most people. The con being that it can very easily become, as Dustin said, tropey. It can become propaganda in the wrong hands. So it's treading that really fine line between education and indoctrination, I guess.
I think a thing I found in doing that, that's a fantastic point, is two things help with that. One, explore things from your character's point of view, not yours. Chances are your characters may hate something you would approve of and vice versa. Characters may like a monarchy. Hey, it's stable. But also, if in doing your world building on these important political subjects, if your world doesn't shock or disturb you at least once, rethink it. As you extrapolate on the world you're building, there are going to be things you create that you don't like. And I always find it's a good fire break to make sure you're really getting into doing good world building and talking about your issues when there's something that clashes with what you expected you'd do. because you're discovering. The reader discovers, but before that, so do you in writing and building the setting. That's always a good firewall, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it also brings us to the next question as well. How can writers use these other types of governments and not just the basic use of government or just the already set in stone governments to create more opportunities within their story?
I think it comes down to research. If you're, I mean, so my background is actually political science. I have a degree in international relations, so I had to sit and study, these different kinds of governments. If you have not, or if you're not even really critically reading the newspaper, that's where you need to start before you start, bringing in all these kind of different things. Just like anything else in world building, anything else in writing, you kind of need to know what you're talking about to do it well. So, I do think, yes, absolutely, writers can find ways to bring in these new or different, I shouldn't say new, nothing's really new, but, bring in these different governments or systems, but then not only researching what the systems are, but look at things like who is controlled under the systems, because in any system, there is going to be somebody who's being controlled. There'll be somebody who's being elevated. So I guess as a writer, you can also expand your own world.
I think it's a good point. History has helped me a lot. And I'd also say everyone realize when you're talking governments and exploring, you have a unique perspective. Whitney has a degree. She has knowledge none of us here have. I come from project management and agile management and systems thought. So I see things differently and I use that. Ask what perspective advantage you have in seeing things. And that's a good place to start to see where your gaps are. And I found that's really useful. Plus you'll have your unique viewpoint that you can bring to your work. So kind of ask what you know and then where you fill in the gaps, because there's going to be a lot of gaps. We're witnessing gaps in political understanding right now.
One thing I would add is, sorry to interrupt. One thing I would add to those two excellent comments is, and in addition to like what you're knowledgeable about, just you have to really think about like what really fascinates you. Like case in point for me, like I mentioned, my background and a lot of my reading is nonfiction outside of writing fiction, and just the idea of like for me, Clash of Empires and the Age of Discovery, that's something that's always interested me. So I think on top of the knowledge that you bring to a particular form of understanding, you have to have like a passion for it because that will come through in your writing.
Okay, so our next question is, how do you choose your government system for the setting in your own story? Whitney, do you want to start since you started last time? So we'll just kind of go in the same circle.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I mean, when I was writing my Shadows of Other Sides series, I had to look at the relationship dynamics of each of the factions within the story and try to understand what is their ghost as a people, as a culture. And then match that to a government system, a governing system. And as it happens, I've got a monarchy, and then I've got, these kind of just kind of small group governments that are effectively autocracies. But then they're all kind of living alongside a human system. So it's blending the world, or like the world and the characters together in such a way that the challenges that are raised in the book are supported by the other factors of the setting, the world building, which in large part is going to be how are they all governed and how are they all interacting not only with each other but with the world.
Stephen, do you want to go next?
Okay, could you repeat the question? I was actually paying so much attention to Whitney's saying.
Yes, of course.
How many books I have to read after this?
How do you choose your government system for the settings in your own stories?
Mine is a strange one because though the setting's techno-fantasy, it's actually repurposed from an unwritten real-world science fiction novel I was working on. That was the idea of post-apocalyptic. So I was able to ask, how would this setting have survived a disaster? And then I realized, well, I already had a design. So it was cobbled together from some real world examples in our world. What I had to do is take the idea of a society that had survived a disaster by having large networked areas based on that was originally our own world, and then extrapolate it to a fantasy world that survived basically a genocidal war and environmental disaster. So I started from a very realistic place, and then I had to start asking how all the magic and everything fit in. And that produced some challenges I didn't expect, because you have magic. If you have magic, people who use magic are weapons with feet. Then I realized that you would have to regulate magic. So, wizards bond to guilds. Guilds have uniforms. You have to legally wear them. You can be arrested for using magic without showing your affiliation. And working out that contrast from a very realistic point of view to add the fantastical was a really interesting effort, because ultimately in a fantastic setting, the government comes down to a lot of mundane choices. So these fantastical things kept getting drawn back, and that was an amazing process, because in the end of the day, if there are gods that use the internet, someone still has to fix the sewers. And a god can send you an email about that. So that was a experience I still am processing, even on book 2.
How about you, Dustin? How do you choose your government systems for the setting in your own stories?
So in terms of how I chose, again, my series, Exiles of the Gilded Moon, the first book is out, Empire's Wake, Shadowspark Publishing. So I started it with a concept, actually. Again, as I mentioned, my background's Caribbean. So, and one of my interests is the age of discovery, when colonization happened. So my kernel concept was, what would happen if, these colonies essentially just got cut off from their mother countries? Like, how would they evolve? So that's kind of what my core concept was. And instead of doing it like in our world, I extrapolated it to like this fantastical world. The mother Europe would be kind of a planet that these moons orbit, and then the colonies were the moons, essentially. So that was kind of how I started, and I figured, there'd be battles between people. A new monarchy would rise from the ruins, and how would that look? So that was kind of how I started. That was the concept of my book.
Very cool. So Stephen has just been casually answering the Q&A, so
You're going to give me one now, aren't you?
I have some other questions to kind of fill our time up. We still have plenty of time, so I'm gonna go with some of these extra questions, and if you guys want to, that are watching, want to drop your questions in the Q&A, I will get to those as soon as there are more up. But how about, let's go with, what should authors consider when choosing a government for their setting? Go ahead, Stephen.
If I could, this is a good question, because you have to really know the culture and the history to figure out what government's being picked. If you're not sure, stop and take a look at the history. What were people's needs? Do things evolve from a tribal setting where there's, multiple people traveling? Are people consolidated in one spot? It's not easy. In some cases, it's probably easy to just break down and go look at a historical area or time parallel to what you know and extrapolate from there. If you want to play anthropologist, then take a look at the history and what matters, because if you have anything like a human, humans naturally organize. That helps us survive. What's the benefit to survival in your setting and in your history? And sometimes you've got to go way far back and ask questions down to environment. Dustin's example of, you have this physical setting that vastly influences the government. But yeah, I usually go back and look over the time and history of any setting and ask, what would people do to survive? Even if it doesn't make sense 100 or 1,000 years later, how would they organize?
Does anybody else want to answer that question, how authors should consider picking their government for their setting?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Dustin.
Go ahead, Whitney. I insist.
Okay. So we've got a lot of sci-fi writers here, I imagine, and I think something that's kind of overdone in sci-fi is perhaps humanizing everything. When we're in space, we don't know what elements are coming together to create what life. So look to other life forms on Earth to see how they are organizing themselves. You know, you could look at ant colonies, you could look at wolf packs, which are not actually arranged the way that people apparently think they are, with alphas, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, just like look at the different kinds of life on Earth and see, okay, how could I build a government or a world or, you know, just an organizational system around something that's not human or doesn't think like a human?
Dustin?
I would add, I agree with both of those sentiments. I think you really have to boil down to your primary character. What's the message you're trying to convey? Because what you're trying to convey, it might not go really well with a type of government that might be of interest to you. So I think you have to think of how is your primary character navigating like their life through to your story response. Does it show character growth and development? That's kind of how I view it. So you have to you have to choose wisely, but you have to think of how does it relate to your character and your characters.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we have a question in the Q&A. Stephen Frey asked, it seems to be easy to depict governments and rulers as antagonists. Is there a way to make them more nuanced or even sympathetic? Go ahead, Stephen.
That's actually, it's a great question because that's an area of interest of mine. My current novel in my Avanoth series, the techno-fantasy one, the government is pretty sympathetic. It's people came together post-war and built something that kind of works. So the thing is there's cracks in it, and it's the story of how two characters and then eventually a group of people that sort of keep finding where the flaws are, keep trying to fix things. So that is a theme of stories that are, you know, things work, but it's all of us all hands on deck to pull together. I want to do a novel outside the setting next, and the rough tagline I make is, what if the deep state was the hero? It's a giant empire slowly corrupting, and a guy walks into a conspiracy of dragons, magic, and enchanted tattoos, and discovers the imperial bureaucracy is literally trying to save the country from a line of mad emperors. So it's a dragon-powered tattooed bureaucrat versus evil. And this case, part of the government really is sympathetic. It's a slow motion rebellion he walks right into ignorantly. And I found that interesting is think about the people trying to just make shit work every day is an area I'm utterly fascinated with in books. So what about the people doing the hard work? That's a great sympathetic area.
Would anybody else like to bounce off that?
Yeah, so I want to take it back to something I said earlier, which is look at who's being controlled in a society. Those people are probably not going to be the ones who are finding the government or the ruler as sympathetic. If you want your government or ruler to be sympathetic or to be more nuanced, you might have to change the perspective of your character to one who actually benefits from that government and benefits from that system. Because I promise you, I mean, even if we just look at the United States, there's a lot of people in this country who do not feel supported, respected, cared for, or even viewed as human. So there's kind of no way for anybody in that position to truly see a government in a sympathetic light. There isn't really a way to show an imperial power sympathetically if you are one of the colonized. So for me, you would have to take it and turn the story around and say, this is somebody who benefits from the system. Alternatively, look at where the system is failing people and what it needs to do in order to address those gaps. Is it doing those things? Okay, then maybe it's a bit more nuanced. Is it not even trying, but performing? Still failing miserably. So it's really got to come down to the character level for me to be able to show that as with any nuance, let alone sympathy.
May I make a quick book recommendation?
Yeah, go ahead.
This plays to what Whitney has said. I recently read Stacey Abrams' book, Our Time Is Now, about voting rights and voter suppression. This is not about being sympathetic to the government, because I assure you she's not. But it is well worth reading because it looks as how we in America repress people over generations.
Right.
And it is an excellent, excellent guide. In fact, I recommend the audiobook. She's a compelling speaker. Not only is it a good book to see how power may work in the US, to see who benefits, who may miss how they benefit, who may be perfectly happy and not know it, but also to miss the rot in the system. Politics aside, it is an excellent study about disenfranchisement and what happens and why. And it influenced my own world building.
Dustin, would you like to speak on this point?
Yes, I would. I really appreciated Whitney's comment in terms of
benefits.
Really focusing on character in Empire's Wake. That's kind of, the character, he's 18, trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life, and unfortunately his whole civilization gets invaded by an unknown power and gets captured as a slave and has to learn how to survive. But the way that the book kind of progresses is he is kind of living his life, but then he has opportunities to see how things are done elsewhere in the empire, and he realizes, oh wow, we've actually been quite disenfranchised. And just as he's kind of coming to that realization, like the whole world shifts. So I think that's kind of a way to portray, like, if you're interested in sympathy versus unsympatheticness from a government, I think if you can have it seen through the main eyes of your character, because like most people, they don't realize all the functions of their government. It's just through kind of personal experience, personal growth, then they can realize, okay, things are not exactly what I expected. And through your character's growth, a reader will quite enjoy that, and having something revealed to them that was unknown before.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point. I'm Native American, so I definitely agree with that point. Okay, so Jade Benjamin asks, how is it possible to infuse new limits into something overdone, like a monarchy, to pull power away from the monarch or show how a governmental system can evolve through the story?
I'd want to know how is it being overdone? And that's going to take a critical analysis of the genre, the trope, the way it's been done in the author's opinion. There are going to be certain things that, yeah, they've been done to death, but if you subvert the trope, that's what makes it fresh. It's doing something that is not just unexpected, but kind of rebellious in a way. It's taking something that maybe other people said, well, you can't have that. It's taking, a story that perhaps has been, excluded for some people and turning it around. It's telling a story from a different perspective that maybe we haven't seen yet. And I think it's also worth remembering that, like, as a writer, nobody can speak the way you do. Nobody has your voice. We all have a story to tell. So I'd also just caution, don't be afraid of thinking like, oh, it's all been done before, because yeah, it has all been done before.
Oh yeah, everything. Yes, definitely.
It's your voice.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it's really, really dangerous to speak on things being overdone, especially for BIPOC writers and queer writers. And it can be a dangerous slope of, well, it's been done by white, cis, hetero people a million times, so it's overdone. And it kind of continues to exclude us from the narrative.
Absolutely agree with that.
If I could, as a white, cis, mostly straight, except Chris Evans is gorgeous guy.
Valid.
No man is straight around Chris Evans. Let's just be honest. This is something that I work with because I try to step outside myself in my writing. But we who come from a privileged background, seeing those stories is not just important to people that are BIPOC, who are queer. We learn from them. There is value in a different voice about the same thing, and the world needs that. And I will very bluntly say this, and this is important for politics. Most everything I've learned the last 10 years has usually been because of a person who is a person of color, a woman, LGBTQA+, or all three. We need those different voices. And that's very important to remember. Just because a white guy said it doesn't mean it's all said. In fact, it probably means jack shit was said. And I want to say that as the resident, whatever I am. So thank you.
I would tag on with, thanks for the thing that I would tag on with what Whitney said as well. It's so hard to say something's been overdone because again, every generation has their new group of writers, and I think that's kind of the beauty of the human experience. A lot of our stories are as old as time, but they're retold and retold, and that's how we kind of pass on new messages and new ways of learning. And sure, we've read about princes and princesses, from since time immemorial, but there's so many ways to tell that story. It'll never truly be overdone.
I can add one thing too that is useful in your writing. I said earlier, your world building should surprise you. A simple thing I did in my novels was I created new ethnicities. Nothing maps to our world. There's a government I referred to as a bunch of Swedish Confucian hippies. And I write characters that are female. Just stepping out of that a little bit blows your mind. So when you're trying to write governments, just take a moment to step out of Something Like You, or don't remap things you've seen. Give yourself a chance to not only color outside the lines, just throw the lines away and see what you learn. It's really, honestly, an experience.
We still have plenty of time here. I'm going to ask a question that's actually not on any of the lists or anything, but I would like to know how you guys deal with colonization and how it impacts your government systems in your writing.
It's a good one. I mean, I think especially, so I was born and raised in the United States. I lived extensively in Europe. So both imperialist colonizing nations. At the same time, I am a Black biromantic woman. So there is an element of, just obviously being the descendant of enslaved people. So in a lot of ways, it's just daily life, reconciling all of those things, all of those different pieces. And I think it's got to be like bringing that nuance into the characters. They can't just be flat.
I definitely agree with that statement. And the way that I portrayed it, again, I'm Black, I'm LGBT. And in my book, the way that I set it up is, again, based on my Caribbean background, I wanted to show like what would it be like in the setting if there's like kind of a hegemonic presence. So as I described it, as a realm of four moons, they're all pretty much descended from an old colonial power that no longer exists and has vanished. But one moon kind of dominates all the other moons. And much like Mr. Savage mentioned, like all the cultures are very mixed. So like the people who are dominant are like black skinned and gray eyed, and everyone else is like brown skinned or red skinned and have various colors of eye color. So like people's skin color doesn't really matter as much. It's just like which moon do they belong to and what's their culture. So I kind of like had that idea of just, showing colonialism kind of from a different perspective. They're all descendants of one colony, but one moon kind of supersedes the others and rules over the others. And then that kind of creates all sorts of, issues in terms of who's wealthy, who's poor, who has access, who doesn't have access. And it kind of is a fertile ground for like exploring a lot of concepts.
Because my settings, well, I guess you and I have a lot in common, Dustin. My settings, what I call post-apocalyptic. There's no immediate colonization except for uninhabited places because there's planetary travel. But the remnants of cultural shifts are like fragments embedded, slivers in the skin of society. So I have to remember all these little details of what happened after that, and then what's left over. So there's one power, which is now called the Western Triad, and they were never imperialistic, but they had their moment. But there was a big imperialist power that like screwed everything up. And one of the remnants is you never wanted, like one character can trace her ancestry back to people that, as she put it in Unused Scene, is, look, I'm a descendant of the bad guys. But the bad guys she's descended from are nothing like the former imperial power, which was basically genocidally wiped out. And the fun thing with that, fun in quotes, is no one wants to talk about it. That essentially the last two great powers, everyone just banded together to bomb the shit out of them. So their post-colonial experience is mass revenge. And no one wants to talk about that. And you have all the other, you have all the other fragments left from previous things. So you'll have a cultural conflict. No one knows why it exists. And it's like writing that ability for people to want to ignore their history is, I said your setting should disturb you. Writing people trying to tiptoe around just mass murder in their pasts and revenge and all these horrible military actions is very uncomfortable to me because none of my characters want to talk about it.
Interesting.
But someday I'm going to get them to. And
I
they're
would,
going to feel like
argue,
shit.
I would argue one point with you, like in terms of the setting should disturb you. I would say, I think in some capacity, yes, in some capacity, no, because I think like the way I try to at least, form I did book 1 and book 2 is going to actually look quite similar. You want people to fall in love with the setting, and then when things change irrevocably, their heart breaks. So I think that's at least the tack that I like to take.
Book 2 is actually, though it started as a parody of Harry Potter. It actually, and She Who Shall Not Be Named. No, it says magical schools suck. It was actually based on Knives Out. So about 1/3 of the way through, just heartbreak after heartbreak starts coming as you realize nothing is what it seems. And there are actually scenes that are painful for me to write. And that's a good example. And I like that idea. You get everyone nice and comfortable and then screw them over. Well, I'm going to be ready to be really hurt.
That has to be perfect. It's just have like at least sense of nostalgia. Things change, and it's hard for everyone. And I think then the reader can really have a lot of sympathy for things.
Okay. Thank you for answering my very random question that is very specific. Since no one else has asked any more questions, I'll just go with a few more of the ones I have here. How do you actively build your government when you're starting your stories, like for world building and plotting? Whitney, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm thinking back to how I was putting together the different governments in Elemental, and I'll be honest, it is probably because of my background, not just studying political science, but again as a marginalized person growing up in a imperialist colonizing country. It is just starting with how is the government, or how is the people in power, how are they screwing other people over? So like the world building, I mean, because you don't really have a story without conflict. You don't have a story without an obstacle. And while I do write a lot of character-driven fiction, I do like to round it out with what's going on in the world. So I guess that's always where I'm going to start with trying to decide how my governments are built, is just going back to that question of how are they getting into people's way. Yes, there's some, there are ways that we can turn that around. So the main character in my book does, form an alliance because the governments aren't working for her. They have specifically excluded her. There are people who have tried to hunt her down and kill her. But she's trying to make something of her own. So it's imagining the flip side of all of that, drama and exclusion, and how not only the protagonist has suffered under it, but how other people have similarly suffered, and how can she pull them together and build something new. So it does go back to that character and control, but then also I think we mentioned earlier the gaps, filling in the gaps, and using that to show a different way.
Anyone else?
I would add, at least the way that I like to portray it is it's kind of like a slow drip, because I hate, to tell everyone everything all at the same time. And it's kind of like self-discovery, at least in Empire's Wake. The main character, he's kind of leads a sheltered life as like an 18-year-old. And as he kind of starts growing up and going out in the world, he learns little bit by little bit. There's scenes where he's like in a classroom and like his professor tells him a little bit of, what their world truly is. And then as he kind of travels, he actually learns. And I think that's the best way to kind of, you and yourself, you as a writer, how it's going to function. But in terms of like letting the reader know, you just have to kind of slowly let it out. Because, it's like if someone were to show up to the United States, and not really learned anything about our culture, but to be given like everything at once, they would never learn everything at once. It'd be just through steady exposure of learning our way of governing ourselves.
Right.
You need a viewpoint, and that's your character.
Absolutely.
Stephen, do you want to give us some advice for other writers on how you start the process of building your government?
As I said, I usually look at what fits the setting and the time, but that's my management point of view. You know, I just look at something and start asking, where did it come from? What do people want? And so on. And I guess this is going to get really, anyone that's like a project manager and an agile scrum master will get this, is I see it as flows of information and power and goals. So I actually view it, one technique I use is, excuse me, the cat is kicking my drink around. You're about to get catted, people. It's an official Zoom call. Jackson, speaking of being ruled, cats, the thing that helps me, and I was reluctant to say this is kind of weird, is I see it visually. And I found that kind of helps too, is if you can view your government as a flow of power, as a flow of resources. A classic example I mentioned, you know, Chinese, some of the Han Empire was you could view it as circles of power and influence. It was a very useful metaphor for me. I read ages ago in my reading about publishing of all things. So try measuring it visually too. One of the advantages beyond saying monarchy, you know, colonization, is visually takes you out of the words. And then when you have to describe the diagrams of powers with words, you're seeing it way differently. So try imagining, viewing, visually using things. Draw a diagram. See how it works. I guess the other final thing is being in a diagram puts you in different perspectives. An example would be from my second novel, is because it's a fantasy setting, there are chosen ones, or as they now have to be referred to, destiny-defined individuals. There's an entire government department called the Messianic Protection Department. They do not exist because these people are dangerous anymore. They exist because they're exploited. So where 300 years ago you would have been a reincarnated hero, now there's someone trying to get knowledge of your past lives out of your head. And that was a very disturbing power shift to write that got weirder and weirder as the book went on. Being, you know, Artemis Fowl sucks in this world, or something else. Being part God means you're going to be hospitalized. That's really interesting to write, but that came up almost by accident when I realized the flows of powers means these people are going to get used. They're going to be exploited. You're not going to be the hero. You're going to be a tool. And that really struck me out of my experiments as something to write. That's just to give an example. When you can see the flows of power, there's something you tamp the hell down on, because it has cultural and forceful implications.
Jennifer Schaefer asked, is there a difference in how you...
sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Dustin. Go ahead and say what you're going to say, and then I'll go to the next question.
I'm going to D-Jackson this.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I agree with that. I agree with that statement in terms of, you know, the flow of power and everything like that. But one thing I would say is, you know, when you're setting out to build a government, definitely put prizes in. And I think the way you can show that, it doesn't have to be just like a data dump. Oh, this happened and this happened. But like, for example, in my book, you know, there are 4 moons that are pretty much ruled by 1 moon. And, you know, there's a lot of antagonism, but like when the character learns it, he realizes, oh, 1 moon actually dominated the others, but there was wars between them, and that's why they hate each other. So I think, you know, showing, you know, the flow of power through like the main character's eyes, it doesn't have to be just like spelled out there, but oh, this is why they don't get along, or this is why they tease each other, or things of that sort. So you can put in like a cultural tidbit, but it actually has like a historical precedent for how they were governed. So I think just by like those small amounts of, you know, characterizations can make things quite interesting.
That does make a lot of sense, yeah.
And those can be very petty. A running issue in my books is arguing over which region invented pizza, which sounds petty, but these other regions, in a setting that is terrified of military conflict, there's all sorts of stupid, petty ways for people to be stupid, petty, and conflicting. So I work those into the setting as there's a lot of dumb, petty rivalries. They are a substitute for war in some cases.
So on to Jennifer Schaefer's question. She asked, they asked, is there a difference in how you depict government at the local level and as opposed to the national or world level?
I show it a lot more personally, because if you're local, these are potentially people in your neighborhoods. They're people in your communities. You may not know their names or where they live, but maybe you see the same people at the grocery store. You see the same people, as you're out jogging or whatever. So I do tend to depict government at a local level as being personal in both good and bad ways. We mentioned pettiness, and pettiness can really spiral out of control if you know these people face to face. But they can also be a hell of a lot more supportive, like we're seeing with mutual aid across the United States, people helping each other on a lower level, on a local level. Whereas I'll tend to depict national and world level as much more vague, simply because, again, my story is very character driven. It is hyper local. I mean, it's local even to where I live. And there are global consequences, but these people are just trying to get through the next day for like the shit they have to keep hidden or to keep running in their own lives. So I think the difference, just to sum that up, the difference is how personal you get and how much detail you give.
Would either of you like to follow up with that?
Sure, I would say at least in my writing, the government is not so intrusive in terms of everyone's, I guess, daily life. Like I'm in the panel about economics at 4 o'clock, so economics makes a bigger impact on their daily lives. They're again under the rule of an emperor, but again, it's a very mercantilist society. So making money, spending money, trade are like the biggest things that they're focused on. So in terms of like decrees and edicts and things like that, those happen, but at least from the day to day, it doesn't really influence your life as much as like having to have a job and earn money.
My stuff is usually hyper local, but because it's a society of many complex levels, I always make sure that I have like little bits of influence. Like the city the characters live in, protest is normal. Like if you haven't gone and annoyed somebody once a month, what are you even doing? But there's just little things that work its way down. Like, there's parliamentary elections happening on different levels and people have to remember that and so forth. And every city is broken into wards or districts, and there's like keeping up with it is hard for them. An interesting thing to your point, Dustin, is the society's not mercantile, but it's driven by social role. Your role is huge. Money is less important. So it's not, I have money. It's, I'm a combat sorcerer. I am part of this guild. I am affiliated with this university. So
interesting.
It's a setting not kind to introverts. And I have to deal with that.
It's interesting, at least, and in my setting, the rulers are the Villagesians, and the Villagesian realm is what it's called, and they pretty much just rule over. They're the ones who trade. They own everything, so everyone's just kind of stuck in this model, and by and large, it works. But they have their own cultures, but it's a hegemony, so to speak. So they kind of have to adopt those manners.
Yeah. I do though, like just making sure, again, it's all coming down to the character level. Again, you can use your own experience. The election and the incredible follow-ups the last few months is a great example of, if that was fiction, your editor would have thrown it the hell out. Because I have never gone and said, and then a dude dressed in a buffalo hat storms the parliament. My editor would have thrown that back to me.
Sure. Yeah.
I would also note one thing. This is very important. If your editor, if you have any amount of politics, get someone not like you. That
would not work for me, because the people not like me want me dead. So
I mean,
yeah,
I should probably comment that for me it was really good because I got someone way outside of what I'm like, and she kicked my ass so hard. Book 1 was improved. Book 2 is much better, and I owe it to my editor Taylor Ramage, who is incredible. She really helped to defuse a lot of things for me.
Yeah, I think that when you're coming from a place of privilege, like you are,
my mistake.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a different experience. Whereas myself as a trans Native American, or Dustin being queer and Black, or Whitney being queer and Black, our experience in the way that we interact with the world, or even editors, is probably a lot more complicated. I have had editors tell me, oh, don't include skin color, readers don't care. And I'm like, yes, readers do care if she's Black, because I care that she's Black.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. On to our last question, and then we need to start wrap up a little bit. Lynn Batik asked, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name, Lynn. What are your thoughts on guilds working as a government?
Very interesting, if I might add. So in my story, there is a race of people that are pretty much downtrodden, so to speak, and it's they were dispossessed of their whole moon and shipped to a pretty much a frozen wasteland. And to survive, they ended up kind of forming guilds, so to speak. So they're kind of seen as mysterious and kind of covert, and people know about them, but it's kind of like just so off the radar that people live their lives and don't really concern themselves with them. But they exist, and they're kind of more lore than real, but they're truly real.
I did once in a past work, and what it came down to was a society of constant, very petty politics and division. And it was fun to write, but a little exhausting. But because I was like, well, everything is based on flow of information, money, and goods. I'm tired of writing this because some of it's really dumb and it wasn't thrilling me, but it was interesting to kind of see it from that point of view of these very siloed groups.
Yeah, I don't really think I have any thoughts in particular on guilds that I haven't really, mentioned before.
So to include the last bit of Lynn's question and kind of wrap up, can everybody kind of give us maybe a closing statement, give us a resource book that you think that some people should definitely pick up, absolutely read, and then tell people where they can find you. Whitney, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So just closing thought, definitely, as has been said a few times, get outside your box. And I think even those of us who are marginalized, maybe you have, identities that we're not part of, that we do still need to explore. This isn't just up to the most privileged in society, it's up to everybody. It's something that, I personally need to work on. It's something I'm sure all of us need to work on. And just understanding how different identities and different intersections move through this world will help you really with writing your fictional world. I guess a resource that I'd recommend on that point is Black Fatigue by Mary Frances Winters. And it's a story, it actually answers kind of Lynn's question here in the Q&A about academic works. It does bring in a lot of like studies and things that are cited to say, why are Black people in America so tired? We are tired. And how does that's the one, yep. And just how does that play into thinking about power, thinking about government, thinking about class? Another book I recommended to a different question was Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I haven't read that one yet, but it's definitely my TBR, and people I trust have said it's really great for looking at class and power. And then I think the last part of the question was where people can find us. Yes, I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Write, WRITE_wherever. And you can find my books on Amazon or wherever else they're sold. I have paperback and ebooks, and the third book is actually coming out on Tuesday, so super excited.
Dustin, do you want to go next?
So I think my overarching message is just really connect with your story and know what the message is that you want to get across. There's so many different ways that humans have organized themselves throughout history, and you have to think of what really kind of is the best vehicle for you to tell your story and get your message across in your own unique way, be it a republic, be it an empire, be it a kingdom. And it has to really matter. You pick it with intention, and you pick it because it's going to really help you tell your story. In terms of books that really have kind of inspired me, again, most of my reading is nonfiction, and one of my passions is reading about the age of discovery and European colonization. So the book that I really found useful in terms of kind of like getting my thoughts together was Empire's Crossroads. The author's name escapes but that's like the only titled book like that on Amazon.
Was that
And it
Carrie
really kind of just is a history book, just telling. Yes, that's for Carrie Gibson. And it just is an excellent history book, and it really kind of chronicles how, for example, Spain colonized like Cuba and Puerto Rico, and it looked at so many different ways of how it happened and so many different forms of government in the colonies. So I think nonfiction is such a good way of getting ideas, and that's at least what's been a good resource for me. And what was the third part of the question? I forgot. Or was there a third part?
Where we can
Where
find
can
you.
people find you?
Oh, sure. Yes, so I am on the internet. You can find me at dustinrcummings.com. You can also find me at the Shadow Spark Publishing website as well. And I am on Twitter as well. And you can buy my first book, Exiles of the Gilded Moon, Empire's Wake, on Amazon or iBooks. And the second one comes out this September.
Final advice on things to do is one thing that helped me is find what you like and then use that to look at history, to learn about governments. I like to cook, I like to write, and I'm incredibly anal retentive. So I've learned a lot from the history of publishing, food, and management. I mentioned my interest in Chinese history. That's the first recorded project management magazine was published on silk in China. So I actually learned a lot through my love of profession. Find something you like and use that to learn about other cultures and places and people, and you'll learn about their history. And that's helped me a lot. Even if I will still defend that project management is the world's fourth oldest profession. The other thing I would say with me is to find me, I have a unique name that is very disappointing when people actually see me. So you can find stevensavage.com. I am Steven Savage on Twitter. I run a site called Seventh Sanctum that's a whole bunch of random generators. And also my writing page, Informotron, I went through a steampunk phase, has my books. And I just dropped my latest book on world building. My coaching guide is on history and world building. And it's not about building history, it's asking about how your culture approaches history and record keeping, and how history is used or kept or ignored or manipulated. So I am not hard to find. Oh, Murad, we have a Seventh Sanctum fan. Yeah, trust me, the new version is coming. I've just been a little held back.
So thank you guys so much. This has been really wonderful. And to everybody viewing, this event is free to attend, but it's not free to host. If you've enjoyed it, please consider supporting the next one via Ko-fi. Diana has posted the link in the chat, as well as there's a link to it on the Discord. And if you guys have any more questions for the panelists, I'm sure you guys will be in the Discord kind of lurking around. And that's it. Thank you guys so much. It's been great.
Let's give it up for our host, Matu, also. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Great
very
job.
much.